welcome to Spring Arbor University, but you already knew that, right? Just want to make sure you realize where you are. Tonight, we are fortunate to have a continuation of, we have a series that we try to sponsor out of Gandy School of Business, Faith, Freedom, and Flourishing. And so thanks to Institute for Humane Studies, they provided us grant money to bring speakers to campus. And this is our second and a half year of doing that. So we appreciate you being here tonight. And a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our guests. I think you will probably get a list to get your email address on, and we also have some cards we'll hand out. As IHS would like for you to fill out a small survey form at your leisure. They just like to know what students think about the various projects that they help fund. So I know you won't remember to do that, but we'll make it as easy as we can for you. So it's not often that you can appreciate what your kids do until you get a little bit older. You know, when they're young and they're, at any rate, I'm very proud of my soon-to-be, you don't want to know how old you are yet, right? But over here is my oldest son sitting kind of by himself, and Eddie, when he went to Savannah College of Art and Design, some of you heard that, met a couple of wonderful people. And it's through his meeting with them and getting to know them, and then consequently and subsequently, Eddie introduced me to this couple. And I said, gosh, if there's ever a way to get them on Spring Arbor University's campus, I really want to do that. And so thanks to Eddie, thanks to IHS and the Gandy School of Business, and most importantly, thanks to the couple I'm going to introduce, Jennifer and Jay. They are actually here, and they're going to inform us and I think educate us and entertain us. A couple of things about Jay and Jenny. They're a married couple. Now that's not so unusual because the Mojos over here, they're a married couple and they're faculty. Jay and Jenny have 3 children. And they're looking at this opportunity as a getaway weekend. In fact, I think Jay said it's like going to Jamaica, and maybe that caused you to question his approach to philosophy, but in reality, but he is with Jenny, so that's good. These two are on the faculty and work with Notre Dame University. They're graduates, or soon to be Jenny has her PhD from Notre Dame. Jay will soon have his PhD. He's working on his dissertation not as we speak, but during this time, well, maybe he's working on it. And Jenny actually, while she has a degree in the theology department, she teaches in a liberal arts department at both departments. She's in both departments. And she teaches in the great books arena. So she teaches literature, philosophy, and theology. And some of you may not know, it's pretty unusual for a university to offer one of their doctoral candidates who successfully completes their doctorate a professorship and what word I'm trying to look for, but professorship, and they have done that with her. And likewise, Jay is now working at Notre Dame and will soon complete his doctorate there. So that's kind of an unusual thing. I think it speaks to their credibility and the work they've done, and they're just a fun couple. And so we do want to welcome Jay and Jenny, and here's, Jay's got a similar CV, and I told him earlier I was just going to kind of read through this 8-page CV of Jenny, but I want you to welcome Dr. Jenny Martin and Professor Jay Martin to our campus. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for that very warm and all too kind introduction, though. I don't think I'll be doing much in the way of entertaining. This is going to be pretty dull, but I'll try to throw a few jokes in again if I have to. So we're just really delighted to be here with you. We've known Eddie for 20-some years, and we're just happy to have these come full circle and to be here with all of you. I've enjoyed meeting some of you that I've already had the opportunity to meet. And I'd like to thank you all for coming as well, and offer particular thanks to Dr. Alan Knight for the very kind invitation to come. Also to the Institute for Humane Studies for offering us the funding and providing the grant, and to Samantha Kavoris, wherever she was, there she is, for all of her help with the logistics of our visit. So thank you so much for everyone who had a hand in putting this together. So as Dr. Knight said, I am a professor of academic theology, but my primary appointment at Notre Dame is in a Great Books department. So in this department, we return again and again to classical core texts in literature and philosophy and theology, history and science that span the duration of Western civilization. So our majors who come in as freshmen or sophomores start their journey in these small seminars. We'll start with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and then over the next 3 or 4 years, we'll read authors as diverse as Herodotus, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Justin, Bonaventure, Aquinas, Dante, Petrarch, Chaucer, Luther, Montaigne, the list goes on and on, up through Freud, Austin, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Virginia Woolf. And so it's been through this process of reading and rereading these texts, especially alongside my own research on the nature of religious tradition and how it operates, that it's made me really deeply attuned to the fact that ideas and language don't develop or come out of a vacuum, but they are situated in a particular historical, cultural, and intellectual genealogy. So the authors in our curriculum, as well as the figures of the Christian tradition, respond directly or obliquely to their intellectual and spiritual forebears as they invoke, evoke, allude to, refine, borrow, or critique the ideas in the language that has preceded them. And it's because ideas and language do aggregate in this way and have a complicated past that I'm often finding myself in my seminars asking my students to define their terms, right? Because the terms, the language doesn't always apply in the same exact way. A word or an idea that might appear to be simple at first blush often carries a really long and complicated history that can inform or deepen or even change the possible range of interpretations. So the title of our talk this evening is Persons and Freedom, Catholic Perspectives on Moral Reasoning. And so I want to spend a little time talking about this long past of person and freedom language. So the concept of person gets complicated pretty quickly. In a modern post-Enlightenment view, a person is generally common sense thought of as an autonomously operating individual, a self-contained subject, an ego or personality with a distinct center of self-consciousness, and agency to have free acts. But in the Christian intellectual tradition, the concept of personhood is first and foremost a category that is fundamentally relational, received as a gift, and ecstatic. And by that, think about the etymological meaning of that word ecstatic, to stand outside of. So the center and meaning of the person literally stands outside of the self, right? Primarily, the center of the person is God, and secondarily in other people and in the community. So given this phenomenon of the accretion of language, I've taken it to be my primary task to provide some of the preliminary metaphysical underpinnings in the Catholic intellectual tradition that will give a fuller context to this idea of personhood and of freedom. The theological tradition is really long and rich and immensely varied and definitely not homogeneous. It's not the same. And I won't do it justice in these short comments. I can only address briefly some doctrinal developments in the patristic and the medieval eras, and then I'm going to privilege the thought of 3 modern Catholic theologians who attend really closely to these ideas of personhood and freedom. The first is Edith Stein, also known as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Her dates are 1891 to 1942, and she was canonized by the Catholic Church in 1998. We kind of move slow in the Catholic Church. They first go, okay, there we go. The second person is Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was born in 1927 and is still living. He's in his 90s now. He made headlines by retiring from the papacy, and Pope Francis came in 5 years ago. And then the third person I want to talk about is my main area of research interest, which is Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. So, all 3 of these thinkers, Stein, Ratzinger, and Balthasar, all share a very strong commitment to Trinitarian ontology. This shapes their understanding of human community, their conception of the central operation of love as self-gift and surrender, and this process that's very gradual of both receiving and forming the moral self. My methodological presupposition tonight, which I do share with Stein and Ratzinger and Balthasar, is that there is a unity between metaphysical or ontological claims that is, those claims about the nature of being itself. Secondly, fundamental Christian doctrines, particularly thinking about God as Trinitarian. And finally, theological anthropology, that is the study of human beings as we relate to God. When we're thinking about articulating the most robust version of personhood and freedom, it's important, I think, to realize that you can't really marshal those concepts to refer to human beings and the ways that we conduct our affairs or that we make moral decisions without thinking about the fullest sense of the term. That is, they refer first and most truly to the reality of God, who is a community of persons in one substance, relating freely in the mode of self-giving love. Okay, so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Trinity. It's going to be easy, right? So let's start thinking about the Trinity with Exodus 3. This is the story of the burning bush, right? You know the story where God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush. The story is really well known. In it, God has heard the cries of the Israelite people. They're being oppressed under the yoke of Egyptian slavery, and calls for Moses to go and intervene with Pharaoh to secure their liberation. So Moses asked God for a name, and God's answer, I am who I am, seems to give with one hand while taking away with the other. At the same time, it reveals something of the divine essence, but on the other hand, it also conceals the essence of God, which is perpetually mysterious, by refusing to provide a name as such, right? He doesn't say Robert, he doesn't say, Joe. He says, I am who am. That's the name that is given. It's very mysterious. So for Edith Stein, for God to say, God is who is, that's another way of saying, as Aquinas does, that God's essence and God's existence are one and the same. Another really traditional way of saying this in Aquinas is to say that God is pure act. And that means that in God, there's no potency as there is with us, right? We can develop and we can change. But that God is fully actualized as an eternally living presence, which is another way of saying that God is being itself, right? It's a philosophical claim. But the fact that God says I, when he gives this name, when he says I am who am, that he does give a name, even if it's not quite a name or maybe even more than a name, it means that God is not being as static or impersonal or merely philosophical, but rather God is being in person, right? Which is to say being as relation. In his really wonderful book, Introduction to Christianity, Joseph Ratzinger, also known as Pope Benedict XVI, provides an interesting etymological reading of this name, Yahweh, that's given in Exodus, that indicates both that God is coterminous with being itself, but is also the personal God, right? Remember how the story goes on. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? So it's God that is a personal God, not an abstract or disconnected being just in itself, but God is a being for the nation of Israel, being for humanity. So in the Catholic theological tradition, personhood is an essentially relational category. And this is true for both human beings and for God, which is kind of a surprising thing. There's a connection between personhood and relationality that gets drawn very early in the tradition, in the patristic and medieval theology as well. A lot of it has its roots in Trinitarian discourse in the 4th century. So you have figures like the Cappadocian Fathers who were writing in the 300s, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianz, and you have figures like St. Augustine who was writing in the 500s. Especially his book De Trinitate, which is this 600-page book on the Trinity, which actually started in 399 and didn't finish until 421 because someone stole the manuscript and started pirating it, just like handing it out to people before he was ready. So he got mad and he's like, I'm not going to finish it until somebody made him. But he did it against his will. So he wrote this enormous book on the Trinity. At the very end, he says, it's kind of didn't work, right? My sort of giant 600-page book on the Trinity didn't work, and we should pray. And so he prays. He ends with a prayer, which I think is always really instructive way of ending this book on the Trinity, right? So he's always moving toward relationship, even in a book about the nature of the Trinity. So you've got someone like Aquinas also in the medieval era, who argues for the suitability of person-relation language for God. He's really careful, though, in the Summa Theologica, which is another giant book. It's like 3,000 pages. But he's careful to indicate that the language of person as relation for God is only analogous. Aquinas says it's fitting to use this term person to refer to God, but it's used, quote, not as it is applied to creatures, but in a more excellent way. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, what the distinction that Aquinas is making here. So, crash course in Trinitarian discourse. Coming up. All right, buckle up. Okay, so we've got traditional language that's used to refer to the mystery of the Trinity. It can really be considered in two main categories. And here I'm just really grossly oversimplifying centuries of doctrinal development. But if we can think of Trinitarian language as substance language on the one hand and relation language on the other. So substance language refers to the unity of God, the unity of the immanent Trinity, the principle of oneness in God's inner being. And relation language talks about the distinction in the Trinity, the names of Father and Son and Spirit that we see in the Scriptures. So as traditionally understood, the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, are distinct from one another only in what's called in the tradition relations of origin. So it's the Father who generates, it's the Son who is begotten, and it's the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now you might ask, what does generation mean? What does begottenness mean? What does procession mean? And the tradition is usually like, we don't know. You know, it kind of works like algebra. It's they're like placeholders for mystery, right? It's you've got words that signify distinction, but when you start pushing on that mystery, you can't really fill it out with the certainty of a science, right? It's so the Cappadocian Fathers who originated this language, they said, you know, it's the relations of origin. The Father generates, the Son is begotten, the Spirit processes from the Father and the Son. But the language itself, it just sort of serves as a window into mystery, right? So you can't really fill it out. Although people have tried. So. Okay, I think we got it sorted out. Okay, so as a summary, the Trinitarian formula is that God is one substance. Okay, go for it. There's a lot happening here. We'll get the duct tape. Okay, it's going to be fine. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, so where were we? The Trinity, right? So the traditional language is that God is one substance in three persons. Like I said, it's the Cappadocians who gave this language. And what's really important about this is that it was the Cappadocians who said that personhood is a relational category. Now we're going to get into some difficulty here, right? Because when we say God is one substance in three persons, a theological problem arises. What do we get? What's the problem? I'm actually asking. One substance in three persons.
They're different?
Yeah, okay. Give me more. Okay, they're different.
Well, how can you have like 3 in 1?
Yeah, okay. How can you have 3 in 1? Like 3 what? What's a person? What's a person to us?
Yeah.
You know, a person to us is like you and me and everybody we know, right? When we think about the Trinity, we're a monotheistic religion, right? So that's a problem. If we're talking about 3 gods, then we got problems. Okay, so that's why the language of personhood needs to get really, like, it's personhood asterisk, personhood footnote, right? I mean, so we've got to really think about what this language of personhood means. So I want to really hit hard this idea that person in the antique language, in patristic and medieval, in the Cappadocians, in Augustine, it does not mean personality. It doesn't mean a distinct agent, right? Because then we have tritheism, which is a massive problem for a monotheistic religion. So let me try to provide a few examples from Joseph Ratzinger. He writes about fatherhood and sonship in Trinitarian discourse. And he tries to say what it is about personhood in this language that makes it different from the modern sense of personality. He talks about fatherhood as pure relatedness, right? This is an interesting kind of thing that he does. And it's the relations themselves, the Father, Son, and Spirit, that provide, that don't impair unity, but actually fill out the unity of the Trinity. So Ratzinger says that the language of fatherhood is purely a concept of relationship. So only in being for the other is God Father. In his own being, in himself, he's simply God. So Ratzinger says person is the pure relation of being related, nothing else. Relationship is not something extra added to the person as it is with us. It only exists at all in relationship. Similarly, in the case of the Son, Ratzinger he refers a lot to the Gospel of John. And you know in the Gospel of John how Jesus is always saying, I and the Father are one. If you have seen the Father, you have seen me, right? He comes back to this language to talk about the being of Jesus as the incarnation of the eternal Son, which is marked by perfect surrender and openness to God. Here I'm going to quote Ratzinger at a little bit of length. He says, the Son does not proceed in any way from himself, and so is completely one with the Father. Since he is nothing beside him, claims no special position of his own, confronts the Father with nothing belonging only to him, makes no reservations for what is specifically his own, therefore he's completely equal to the Father. This logic is compelling. If there's nothing in which he is just he, no kind of fenced-off private ground, then he coincides with the Father, is one with him. It's precisely this totality of interplay that the word Son aims at expressing. To John, the Gospel writer, Son means being from another. Thus, with the word, he defines the being of this man as being from another and for others, as a being that is completely open on both sides, who knows no reserved area of the mere eye. When it thus becomes clear that the being of Jesus as Christ is a completely open being, a being from and toward, which nowhere clings to itself and nowhere stands on its own, it is also clear at the same time that this being is pure relation, and as pure relation, pure unity. He also gives a kind of message to the Christian, right? So he says, being a Christian means being like the Son, becoming a son, not standing on your own as yourself, but living completely open in the from and the toward, right? So when he does his Christology later, he talks about Jesus on the cross with his arms out. He says he's a being who's totally open on both sides, right? He comes from the Father and is identical with the Father, and he pours out his love for humanity, right? So this kind of totally open, transparent self that doesn't insist on his own ego, sort of fenced off from relation. That's what it is to be a human person. That's what it is really to be a genuine person. So let me point out that we have a really crucial distinction when we're talking about human personhood and divine personhood. Earlier I said that Ratzinger said relationship is not something extra added to the person as it is with us. Let's talk about that distinction a little bit more. So I'm going to use some Aristotelian language. This will be fun. So Aquinas argues in the Summa Theologica that in God, relations are not accidental or contingent as they are in human beings, but are instead subsistence. I think we need to clarify this language a little bit. So in Aristotle, in the language of predication, there's a logical distinction between substance and accidents. Is this familiar-ish? Okay. So we'll go over it just to make sure. So substance is the nature of a thing that makes the thing itself. It makes the entity itself. And accidents, on the other hand, just refer to contingent features that may or may not obtain about a particular entity and does not change the kind of thing the substance is. Let me give an example. So I am a human being, actually. So human being, that's my nature or my substance. And I would remain a human being regardless of the particular accidents that apply that might modify my substance. So like my hair color, my eye color, I could dye my hair, I could change clothes, I could move over here, I could move over there, position, right? Those kinds of things are Aristotelian accidents. Position, color, dress. The thing that's really important is that I would remain a human being regardless of how my relations change. So I was a human being, not as happy, but I was a human being before I married Jay, right? So those relations are important, but they're contingent. I was a human being before I became the mother of our 3 children. Again, important relations, but not necessary to my substance. My substance doesn't depend on them. But for God, in the tradition, these eternal relations of origin of Father, Son, and Spirit are essential to God's nature. They're substantial relations. That's Aquinas' language. They're essential to God's nature as love. Okay, so just a quick summary. As triune, we've already determined God is both 1 and 3. 1 with respect to substance, and 3 with respect to these eternal relations of origin, otherwise known as persons, or hypostases in the Greek, of the Father and the Son and the Spirit that relate to one another in this mode of mutual, free, creative self-gift. As Edith Stein says, a giving of the self is the act of one who fully possesses himself, that is, a person. In the case of God, however, the act of a person who is and loves not in the human manner, but who is love, or whose very being is love. The divine love must itself be a person, the person of love. So, a much simpler way of saying this, we might say with the Johannine literature, God is love. Right? We've heard this before, right? This is a simple sentence, right? God is love. You know, there's people who say that all of this kind of philosophical language about the Trinity is just a footnote on that simple statement, right? So we know that copular, the is in the middle of that sentence, makes God and love equal, right? So God's being is love, God's being is relation. Augustine does this at the very center of this very long and complicated book on the Trinity. He comes back to this right in the hinge chapter of that text in book 8. He says, God is love. He says, in order to see and to know God as Trinity, the only thing we really have to see is what true love is. Right? I mean, so the Trinity is so mysterious, but he says the only thing we really have to see is what true love is. So for someone like Edith Stein, she will say, and Augustine says this, Ratzinger says this, and Balthasar says this, that the highest form of love is a mutual eternal love. This is only possible and possibly actualized in these Trinitarian relations of self-gift. Stein goes on, she says, here each person finds himself in the other. Since both their life and their nature are one, this mutual love is simultaneously self-love and a self-affirmation of the person's nature or essence. In the realm of creatures, the closest approximation to this pure love, which is God, is the self-surrender of finite persons to God. Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit in the time I have remaining, that's pretty short, about the notion of theological freedom. And again, like theological persons, theological freedom begins in God and is extended to human beings only secondarily and in a mode of gift. So this theological account of freedom, I think, contravenes all of the weak accounts of freedom that's understood maybe in terms of just license. You know, I'll do what I want to do when I do it. And the exercise of a very autonomous will, acting without constraints, either internal or external constraints. So I'm going to use Hans Urs von Balthasar a little to talk about this idea of theological freedom. In the wake of the Second Vatican Council, he wrote a little book called Engagement with God that's about 100 pages, which is a sort of pre-seer synopsis of his enormous 5-volume, I like 500 pages a pop, theological drama, theodrama. So it's a kind of the shorter version, the Cliff Notes version of the theodrama. So that's what I used instead of the big one. So in this text, Balthasar articulates the meaning of true personal freedom. And he articulates it against the horizon of modernity, whose accounts of freedom are at best only partial and at worst are counterfeit of this genuine article. So he says these atheistic philosophies are totally obsessed with this problem of freedom. But here, and I quote, he says, the Enlightenment was concerned with the freeing of reason from the fetters of fate. Marx wrote of the freeing of economically enslaved man in order that he may undertake work suited to his dignity. Freud wrote of the freeing of the individual from the bondage of a past.
Nietzsche spoke of the rescuing of the whole of mankind from the nightmare of the God that is no longer believed in and which has been dragged along like a corpse through world history. Right? So all of these thinkers in modernity think they know what freedom is. But against these currents of thought, Balthasar says it's really only Christianity, not any of these other systems that talk about it as constraining human freedom, that has the capacity to give us actual freedom. And this is so for Balthasar because it originates not in displays of autonomous power or willing, but in the nature of the triune God. He says God's free revelation of himself in Christ is an invitation into the realm of an absolute and divine freedom, in which alone human freedom can be fully realized. So freedom then gets offered out of the abundance of Trinitarian love and surrender, and that invites us to participate in the same love of Father and Son and Spirit. What this means is that the primary matrix of the exercise of freedom isn't power, but it's entering into this open expanse of radical and boundless love. In this context, freedom doesn't mean just the license to do what I will, but paradoxically, I think, implies as its correlate obedience and surrender. I want to return to Exodus for just a moment. I think it's really pertinent. So remember, the book of Exodus tells the story of the liberation of the people of Israel from slavery. But it bears out this non-competitive relationship between genuine freedom and obedience. Israel gets liberated from her slavery at the hands of the Egyptians. But the nation doesn't trade one kind of slavery for another, right? She doesn't become a slave to the Egyptians and then become a slave to Yahweh. In Balthasar's reading of the text, Israel knows she's been liberated in order that through following the God of liberty, she may enter upon a freedom that is truly her own. The foundation of her choosing, which is God's innate freedom, must correspond with the ultimate purpose of her choosing, namely that she may participate in the liberty of God himself. So what Balthasar does here is he puts this idea of liberty in the context of mission or vocation, when we're called by God for our particular vocation in life. An individual's mission in this way is freely given by God and freely accepted by the believer, and it's performed freely, not just for my individual good, but for the good of the whole community, the church community, and the broader human community. Being given this mission or vocation from God, being invited to act as kind of God's free agents in the world. For Balthasar, it transforms egos or bare selves into theological persons. It's just like as Israel became a nation when God calls her, so too the Christian becomes himself or herself when God gives us mission or gives us a vocation. It makes the I become the self in Balthasar's language. Just to end, I'm going to talk a little bit about Edith Stein's notion of how selves or persons are formed in this way. She has a really complicated philosophy of self-formation that rests on Husserlian phenomenology, and I will spare you. I'll spare you those. But just, I'll sort of sum it up in two kind of directives that she gives. The first might be like the Delphic injunction, know thyself. The second one might be, come to be what you are, right? For Stein, the soul has to find itself in a double sense. It must first learn to know itself, and it must come to be what it is destined to be. But for Stein, human persons don't come to know themselves all at once like God does, but gradually and always provisionally, through a glass darkly, if I could borrow an image from St. Paul. But this process of gradual self-formation, this process of becoming persons from bare self or bare egos, and these becoming the persons that we truly are, requires the exercise of genuine freedom and creativity. Now, Stein knows that not all of us exercise the fullness of this freedom, or that we can exercise the fullness of this freedom over the course of our lives. But she says most people kind of just abandon themselves to a large extent to the pressures and the forces of external and internal events and drives, right? We just kind of coast along. But she says human beings actually possess this really wonderful and creative capacity to transform our inner spiritual selves. She talks about this freedom in the following way. She says, here the I can be genuinely creative out of the depth of the self. What we call free acts a firm resolve, the voluntary inception and execution of some action, the explicit turning toward a rising thought, the conscious termination of a succession of ideas, as well as all of our questioning, our demanding, our granting, promising, commanding, and obeying, are deeds of this I that are manifold in their meaning and inner structure, but uniform in one respect. So the power to form the self in Edith Stein, to actually contribute freely to the development of one's own spiritual life, might look at first blush like a usurpation of authority that might belong to God. But remember, this is happening against this backdrop of the prior surrender, against this fundamental posture toward being of the reception of a gift, right? It's being is giftedness, and personhood is giftedness, and freedom is giftedness. We've already said that theological personhood is received reality, not just for human beings, but for God. Our being comes to us physically from other people in biological generation, but this happens with God as well, since this idea of Trinity comes as mutual self-gift. The Father is the Father because the Son is begotten. The Son is the Son because generated from the Father. The Spirit is the gift because of this mutual self-emptying or self-gift of Father and Son. All of us reflect God as human beings insofar as we bear the stamp of the Imago Dei. What this means is contested, right? But it's reason, it's freedom, it's community, it's relation, it's mystery. We're the only creature on earth that God has willed for its own sake. From our conception, we're destined for eternal beatitude. So every human being that you know in this room and everywhere else is an unutterable mystery, a particular, unrepeatable someone, so inimitable as to be an absolutely irreplaceable pearl of great price, for which an entire kingdom and all earthly possessions might be sold. This radical uniqueness of each and every human soul is not just a passing phenomenon, but is preserved eternally in our ultimate destination for participation in the infinite being of self-giving love. So I started this presentation with a reflection on the name of God in Exodus 3, and I want to conclude with another reflection on the even more, I think, mysterious name, or equally mysterious name, that's given at the other end of the Bible in the book of Revelation. So in the book of Revelation, there's this verse I've always been kind of obsessed with, Revelation 2:17, and it says, to the victor, I shall also give a white stone upon which is inscribed a new name, which no one knows except the one who receives it. What might that mean, to receive a white stone upon which is written a secret name? This hidden name that belongs essentially to you, and which gets you exactly right, that reveals your truest and your most deepest self, since it was God that had given it to you. Both Balthasar and Stein refer to this verse. Balthasar connects it with mission or vocation. Stein says that this secret name of revelation enunciates the innermost essence or nature of the recipient and reveals to this recipient the mystery of his or her being that is hidden in God. Whatever we know of this deeply hidden nature in ourselves and in others remains dark, mysterious, and ineffable. But when our earthly life ends and everything transitory falls away, then every soul will know itself as it is known, as it is known before God, in the what and the why and the whither which God had in mind when he created this personal soul. This is essential in the status which it has attained in the orders of nature and grace by virtue of our free choices. We receive our personhood then as we receive a name, as pure potency, as our own distinct expanse into which the gift of our being becomes the grace of our becoming, provided we cooperate in freedom with the profound gratuity in which it is given. Who we are cannot be known, even to ourselves, until we see ourselves finally as God sees us, when these true names have been revealed. This account of theological personhood and theological freedom that I've been after tonight has, I think, some obvious ethical implications, which I think Jay's going to speak to a little further. But if human beings are beloved of and chosen freely by God to participate in the fullness of freedom and personhood, if we're given a mission and a new name by God, which confers upon us infinite dignity, it'd be a great mistake to treat him or her as a thing, as a means to an end. If all human beings have this same complexity and depth and freedom as recipients of the extravagant love of the Trinitarian God, who is substantially love, substantially relation, If all human persons are called by God into full participation in divinity, then we have to love one another as God loves, truly and wholly and freely. I think at this point I'll stop and let Jay come and talk to us about Kant. Sounds fun. All right, thank you.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
Well, thank you for having us here tonight. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Alan Knight, who extended this invitation to us, and to Samantha for her help in planning our visit, and to the Ganey School of Business here at Spring Arbor, for including us in this Faith, Freedom, and Flourishing speaker series, as well as the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University for their generous support for tonight's event. I'd also like to thank Eddie Knight, Dr. Knight's son, and one of my oldest and dearest friends, for coming tonight. Not merely because I want to give him a shout out, but also because I'd like to draw attention to the notion of friendship more generally. I'll be arguing tonight, at least in part, that the so-called personalist revolution in 20th century Catholic moral thought restores the priority accorded to persons and the ways of relating between them, friendship perhaps chief among them, to the modern field of ethics and moral theology that were once critical to classic and medieval thinking. So Jenny said she spared you some phenomenology I won't. And any Kantians in the room, my apologies in advance. So moreover, in calling attention to friendship, calling attention to friendship highlights a particular idiomatic pattern in the New Testament and its soteriological reflection, in which through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we can once again enjoy friendship with God. Jesus related not only to the apostles as friends, but to all gathered around him as friends. In the 15th chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father." Probably familiar with that already. Though the notion of friendship with God is present in the Hebrew Scriptures, it is a recurring theme in the Psalms, especially those written by King David. For example, in the New Testament we are called friends directly by God in the person of Jesus Christ. The central aim of my paper is twofold. First, it is to identify and critique a fundamental weirdness of modern moral philosophy, which I identify with the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant and its influence on subsequent thought. Though a case could be made that the story actually begins with Descartes, we can leave that alone for the time being. Second, it is to register the worries of Catholic moral philosophers and theologians with respect to the Kantian paradigm, and to introduce the ethical personalism of Pope John Paul II, once Karol Wojtyła, in both its Polish names are so awesome. I live in South Bend, where we have a ton of any Poles in the house tonight. Respect. I taught high school for a number of years with all these crazy Polish names. Anyway, I love the Poles. I love JP too. I had to introduce the ethical personalism of Pope John Paul II in both its philosophical and theological modalities, as the most promising way in which the virtues of Kant's ethics might be retained. So I'm not a monster, I want to jettison Kant entirely. And the structural antagonisms that obtain within it might be mitigated. More on both points to follow. In any case, my argument is relatively modest. I'm certainly not claiming that Kantians are unethical, or that even that Kantian principles, if adopted, would not admit a moral life, but simply that Kant misdescribes in what ethical responsibility consists and how moral deliberation ought to proceed. Most importantly, Kant's ethics exclude recourse to a phenomenology of persons, that is, to persons as they appear within the field of human experience, as a factor in moral calculus. In fact, Kant gives good reasons to think that to do so would be to our ethical detriment. It is this disinterested, formalistic quality of Kantian ethics that I find so weird. Of course, person is a moral as well as metaphysical category for Kant, and his moral philosophy is rightly called a respect for a person's ethic, or an ethic of human dignity. Furthermore, Kant is a moral universalist who believes that general moral truths apply equally to all people, or to all persons, rather. Thus, Catholic moral thought does find substantial common ground with Kant in certain respects, particularly on his recognition of conceptual and moral importance of the human person, for uniqueness and dignity, and moral universalism, however much it will articulate those or analogous commitments differently. So the main lines of Kantian moral philosophy developed over the course of just over 2 decades, which is a long time to be thinking about these kind of questions. Beginning with the publication of the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals in 1785, and the Critique of Practical Reason in 1787, and then the Critique of the Power of Judgment in 1790, before finally publishing his most developed and final statement of his ethics in the Metaphysics of Morals in 1797-98, somewhere around there. Despite the series of transformations that are effected in Kant's moral philosophy over this 20-year period, and readers of Kant, I'm sure you like me, find this particularly frustrating because he takes one idea and he restates it with a little change and does it over and over and over and over again, which is cool. I just don't want to read about it all the time. Excuse me. And yes. So Kant, So Kant developed sort of, okay, so over 20 years of period, there's this minor changes and restatements. But overall, there's a marked consistency with respect to its fundamental elements and patterns of reasoning first elaborated in the groundwork. Even though certain concepts like the categorical imperative seem to drop out as Kant's ethical thought matures on the one hand, and also that Kant never seems happy with how he conceives the relationship between moral and theoretical reflection on the other. For Kant's late 20th century Catholic critics like JP2, the personalist revolution nevertheless rests on the shoulders of Kantian achievement. Throughout Man in the Field of Responsibility, which was written in 1972, the Holy Father's personalist ethical treatise, which brought together his earlier engagements with sex and marriage in his book Love and Responsibility, and then his densely and I can't stress densely enough phenomenological treatise on human experience in the acting person, which was written in 1969. But Kant serves as the representative of modern utilitarian ethics. In each text, JP2 engages Kant, and he credits Kant with clarifying moral concepts that make the development of personal choice possible, particularly insofar as he provides a non-utilitarian ethics, an ethics that surpasses the notion of moral deliberation being treating things as means to an end. Of what utility do you get out of a particular action? And if there's a maximal amount of utility or sufficient amount of utility, then we can talk about this being good, and so forth. Excuse me, I'm going to mark Rubio real quick here. So. Okay. In both Love and Responsibility and The Acting Person, John Paul identifies in Kant a sort of formalistic personalism, it's a phrase that he uses, which insists that human persons must be treated as ends in themselves and not merely means to other ends, though it refuses to countenance the experience of the human act as such. Thus, the personalist critique of Kantian ethics is not an ideological one. It is rather a personalist one. If Kantian ethics must be surpassed, it is precisely because they are inadequate to the phenomena of human moral activity, persons, and ends. The arc of the Catholic personalist critique of Kantian ethics centers around two main structural elements, namely, first, the person, sort of the concept, the category of person, and the moral imperative. It is important to know that Kant's ethics are part and parcel of his so-called critical philosophy, which was inaugurated with the publication of the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. And again, that's 40 years before his publication of the Groundwork. This point is particularly important for understanding Kant's notion of the person and its role in ethics, as well as for understanding why the personalists rejected it. The project of the first critique, in large part, and for my present purposes this will have to be an oversimplification, was to recognize the limits of metaphysical knowledge, that is, knowledge of things in themselves, and to demonstrate that most metaphysical notions and problems are accessible only epistemologically, that is, through our perceptions of them. If they are not, in fact, epistemological concepts and problems masquerading as metaphysical ones to begin with. Metaphysical concepts must be, as Kant puts it, submitted to the, quote, fiery test of critique. Hence, Kant's famous distinction between the noumena, the thing in itself, or as Kant puts it, das Ding in sich, and phenomena, The thing is, it appears to us. For Kant, it is only the latter that we can have substantial, genuine metaphysical knowledge. It should be no surprise then that Kant's theory of the person will be worked out accordingly. Whatever the person is as such, we can only have knowledge of persons in terms of how they are presented to our senses. If metaphysics suffers a subordination to epistemology, theology fares far worse in terms of its status as a source of knowledge. As in Kant's view, the claims of theology do not address and certainly cannot be verified by perceptual experience. In light of Jenny's talk, it is already clear how this view represents a massive departure from the rich tradition, and my biases are coming through, from the rich tradition of Christian speculation of persons, which is both heavily reliant on the terminology of classical metaphysics as well as the content of biblical revelation. In his elaboration of the concept of person, Kant avails himself of one of neither resource, and to his credit, he is ruthlessly consistent. We can derive no genuine knowledge from metaphysical descriptions of persons, which effectively brackets the entire Western philosophical tradition from Plato to Descartes, on the one hand, and the Christian theological concepts developed from the Bible through Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and the Protestant reformers on the other. Yet things are complicated. Kant is not a reductivist or a positivist, at least not in this respect. He is both in other respects, but not in this. So his project is largely one of translation rather than elimination. Take, for instance, Kant's reckoning with the Christian notion of the imago Dei, the image and likeness of God, that the biblical tradition says we are created in. So the imago Dei, which not only figures definitionally into classical theological understanding of person, but also governs its formulation of human dignity. For Kant, the conviction that human beings are created in God's image and likeness is meaningful, even helpful. But in order for it to constitute genuine knowledge of a metaphysical fact, it must be conditioned to the demands of reason, and conditioned the way he does. But in so doing, the imago Dei becomes an analogy for our sensible experience of the dignity of human beings, which has its own philosophical justification according to Kant firmly within reason. Moreover, the meaning of the imago Dei and other metaphysical theological terms is completely lost if the connection to sensible perception is lost. The move is characteristic of Kant's philosophy of religion more broadly. Religion must be shown to be founded on morality, which is to say that it must conform to the dictates of reason and to sensible perception. So far, so good, everyone? I don't feel any like seething pro-Kant hate directed to it, so I appreciate it. Thank you for your restraint. In short, for mainline Christian theology, human dignity is conferred by humanity's relationship to God. For Kant, however, foregrounding human dignity in terms of our relationship with God is problematic for two reasons. The first of which we have already mentioned. The second reason, though, is more philosophically interesting. Kant argues that dignity is an essential property of human nature, and it is grounded in the human capacity to give oneself freely to the moral law, or what he calls autonomy, which we're calling the word's Greek etymology is the compound of the sort of reflexive prefix auto, or which means self, and nomos, the Greek word for law. Thus, to be autonomous for Kant is to choose freely one's own law, and that freedom implies an active, and that freedom implied active in autonomy can only be known through its effects. It cannot be known in and of itself. As with Christian theology, human dignity is paramount for Kant's concept of the person, but for entirely contrary reasons. Yes, as with Christian theology, yes. Okay. Moreover, far from conceiving the moral law in terms of the Christian natural law tradition, Kant characterizes the moral law in terms of let me just strike that and start again here. Okay. Moreover, far from conceiving the moral law in terms of Christian natural law tradition, Kant characterizes the moral law as the felt experience of moral obligation to which the human will responds, which follows his theory from the epistemic requirement that in order to be meaningful, the moral law itself must be defined in terms of sensible perception and experience. We should notice something very weird here. This is so weird. And yes, in the conjunction of autonomy, dignity, and moral law. Given Kant's prioritization of autonomy and his empiricist or perceptual construal of the moral law as referring to one's response to moral obligation, human dignity consists in the freedom to choose one's own law, but on his own terms, Kant can make no requirements as to the composition of the moral law. In other words, as to the content of one's own moral law, that is, the set of moral precepts and prohibitions contained in it, Kant, like Wittgenstein, must pass over in silence. So Kant can stipulate that we must have a moral law, but Kant cannot actually populate that with moral dictum, so to speak. That's so weird. I mean, I've read Kant for years. I find him weirder and weirder the more I read him. Yet Kant is not a nihilist. Again, things are complicated. Rather, he is confident, and overly so, in the certainty with which the existential experience he describes in the preface to the Critique of Practical Reason is universal. He writes, and this is a nice famous quote from Kant, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. I do not seek or conjecture either of them as if they were veiled obscurities or extravagances beyond the horizon of my vision. I see them before me and connect them immediately with the consciousness of my existence." End quote. Again, Kant is maddeningly consistent. On the one hand, he insists on the self-evident nature, not only of the material world and the moral law, but also of his feelings of awe that arise from them. On the other hand, however, his reason for not speculating after either of them is simply because the inclination to do so does not arise. In fact, it is clear that it is not clear what other reason he could give for not doing so. Interestingly, Kant claims that there is only one moral law that human beings freely choose as their own. Again, Kant is a moral universalist. But at the same time, it is not a law that consists of moral precepts and prohibitions. The moral law for Kant consists of what he calls the categorical imperative, which is an ethical maxim provided by pure practical reason, that is, reason that is free from any incentive to follow it. The categorical imperative, unlike a hypothetical imperative, is when Christ says to Peter, if you love me, you will feed my sheep. That's hypothetical. It expresses a universal, the categorical imperative expresses a universal moral norm that is without exception is to be followed as an end in itself. It applies to all people at all times and for all reasons, and it admits no incentive beyond being obedient to it. Though he gives several articulations of it in the groundwork, as well as later ethical works, we shall examine his first and most well-known version, which is as he writes, quote, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." Thus for Kant, the rightness or wrongness of an action is not contingent upon its consequences, so far so good, but rather upon whether it fulfills our duty. Again, pretty good. And it is the categorical imperative that determines what our duties are. Not so great. Okay, and we'll see why. In many ways, and for most people, following the categorical imperative is sound advice for moral deliberation. I should not steal, for example, because I would not wish for the permissibility of theft to become universal, and conversely, I do not steal because I wish for the impermissibility of theft to be universal. Yet we notice the categorical imperative's constituent weirdness, namely that it depends on what we would will. Thus, the categorical imperative gives the form of moral deliberation without giving any content. That's weird. That's really weird. And for this reason, it is called ethical formalism, which leaves open at least a logical possibility that someone could act according to an evil maxim and will that evil maxim to become a universal law. If anyone's ever had the misfortune of reading the Marquis de Sade does exactly that. And one of my intellectual heroes, Jacques Lacan, in the French psychoanalytic tradition, has a great article where he goes after, he shows how Sade is actually a by-the-book, sensible Kantian. But that's for another time, definitely another place. Moreover, when Kant famously treats the notion of radical evil in religion within the bounds of reason alone, which is late in 1795, he seems only to conceive of moral failure either in terms of failing to cooperate with the natural inclination to meet our moral obligations. So we have the inclination, but we are too morally weak to act upon it, on the one hand, or the choice of a maxim inferior to the categorical imperative, on the other. Kant cannot seem to imagine the choice of an evil maxim that would be willed universally, that is, an evil that is categorically imperative. For his Catholic personalist critics, both Kant's understanding of person and his dependence on the categorical imperative will be problematic. But before turning to this critique, it is worth mentioning two historical factors. We're back in Catholic territory, feeling great. Okay. So first, in the periods between the First and Second Vatican Councils, God had come into vogue in certain sectors of Catholic theology. The transcendental Thomism of the mainly Jesuit figures like Joseph Marechal, Pierre Rousselot, Paul Bronner, Bernard Lonergan sought to bring Kant's philosophy into constructive, though not uncritical, conversation with the magisterial philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Though the advent of personalism should be understood in this context, insofar as it is the continuation of 19th and 20th century Catholic engagement with Kant, it is distinct from transcendental Thomism in important ways. And you'll have to take my word for it, that's really boring stuff. But it's its own deal. So it's part of this sort of movement of mediating Kant and Kant's resources, but it is different. Okay, and second, as John Paul II himself notes, Catholicism experiences a revitalization of the concept of person in the 20th century through two crucial developments, one philosophical and the other ecclesiastical. The first is the development of the phenomenological philosophy of Edmund Husserl, who lived from 1859 to 1938, who was Edith Stein's teacher that Jenny talked about, and Max Scheler, who lived from 1874 to 1928, who taught both Stein and John Paul II. And its continued enthusiastic reception in Catholic thought to the present. Phenomenology is largely the study of the structures of consciousness, and this is the part that I'm not sparing you, that Jenny's kindly spared you. Phenomenology is largely the study of the structures of consciousness as given in first-person intentional experience, that is, as consciousness is directed to objects or experiences, but in a way independent of mental states. The person, on the phenomenological account, is defined as the experiencing self, a self that is constitutively structured to be, as Robert Sokolowski puts it, involved with truth. We'll have a place over there, we'll come back to this. The second crucial development is the gathering of the Second Vatican Council, which began in 1962 and ended in 1965. And though human dignity had first come to the fore in modern Catholic social teaching in Pope Leo's the 13th encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, which if you haven't read, it's really good. It received its most definitive magisterial expression in Vatican II's pastoral constitutions, Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae, which identified the human person as the point of contact, that's the phrase, the point of contact between the concerns of the church and the world. In other words, the formulation of ethics, both sacred and profane, must be adequate to the reality of the human person and not to the mere fulfillment of formal moral duties. Looking at Immanuel Kant here. The Council not only made substantial contributions to the Catholic understanding of persons and their dignity along phenomenological and personalist lines, it also, and perhaps more importantly, appeared to give its imprimatur to the renewed interest in the concept of person that galvanized the Catholic interest in phenomenology and personalism to begin with. As Jenny has shown in 20th century, in greater detail, 20th century Catholic theology, philosophy, and ecclesiastical politics foreground the necessity of a metaphysically thick relational ontology of the human person, who is created in the image and likeness of the triune God and is endowed with both dignity and a relational yet universal moral obligation to others in light of that. In other words, the Catholic Church submits its charisma, its proclamation, and moral teachings not to the fiery test of Kantian critique, but only to the true light of Jesus Christ. Maybe one, two more Rubios, and then I'll be done. The personalist revolution in Catholic ethics, in turn, especially in the thought of John Paul II, provides an ethical framework adequate both to the reality of God's loving relation to humanity and the phenomenon of the human person as she exists and experiences the world. Exists in and experiences the world. In Man in the Field of Responsibility, the Holy Father elaborates a decidedly phenomenological view of ethics. In contradistinction to Kant, ethics is not simply a discernment of our duties to one another, but is rather a philosophical theory of the experience of morality, of how we experience our duty to love one another. Fulfilling our duty to love one another on a personalist account surpasses what is required by the categorical imperative, insofar as our duty is precisely to love, and the object of love can never be a formal ethical maxim, but must always be the person herself. It is St. Thomas Aquinas, not Kant, who provides John Paul II with a normative understanding of the human person. Aquinas writes, in the Summa, person signifies what is perfect, is most perfect in all nature. And that's a lot different from Kant. The most perfect in all nature. That is, the subsistent individual of a rational nature. Personalism, then, is the ethical elaboration of one of my favorite lines from Hans Urs von Balthasar. Love alone is credible. Perhaps the most subtle and profound achievement of the personalist revolution and its retention of one of the most important achievements of Kant's ethical theory, namely its universalism. If individual persons each constitute the ethical standard, in each moment moral deliberation, how then is personalism not tantamount to a specious form of relativism? The answer is bracingly metaphysical. The contribution of phenomenological analysis, what Husserl calls reduction, is a way of analyzing particular experiences in order to arrive at what is essential to an object or person as it or she appears in the field of experience. In a phenomenology of the person, what we experience as fundamentally and essentially human is the human act, or put otherwise, that the human person acts. Thus, we have access to the metaphysical notion of person through the individual phenomenological experience of acting persons, of the structural, undifferentiated, and indeed free capacity to act, logically prior to intentionality, moral or otherwise. So this capacity to act before it's directed either to attending to a particular phenomenon, or to making moral decisions, or making expedient decisions about what you're going to get through the drive-thru, is that capacity to act. We discover and learn that each human being, in her particularity and givenness, bears the truth and dignity of all human beings. In the field of responsibility, John Paul II names this insight the personalist norm. And in his articulation, we can see the vestiges of Kant's anti-utilitarianism. But it's a passage that's worth quoting directly. Quote, "The personalistic norm indicates a direction for the justification of norms, of the norms of human morality. It is a direction somewhat different from the direction of natural law, although it is rather complementary than opposed to it. Understanding justification thus," this is translated from Polish, not very great translation, but it's the only one we got. I don't read Polish. "Understanding justification thus, we can take into consideration in a particular way those axiological relations which are proper to the person and flow out of his ontic reality. For we take into consideration the truth about the trans-utilitarian significance, that is significance that exceeds utilitarian calculations, about his autoteleology, that is being an end in himself, which excludes taking him as a means to an end. Finally, we take into consideration the particular value of love, which as a principle of behavior best corresponds to the reality which a person is." Which is a great line. One more time. They just, of love, which is as a principle of behavior best corresponds to that reality which a person is. End quote. Thus, the personalist norm not only replaces the categorical imperative within a system of ethics, but also recenters the human person as the locus of moral deliberation and aesthetic valuation, as well as the intentional object whose inherent dignity can only be expressed by loving and being loved. Perhaps it is because I'm a bit of a company man that I find that I cannot but see this as wildly superior to a Kantian theory of ethics. It is true. But it could also be that I think in personalism we have the ethical theory we need and not the ethical theory we deserve. An ethical theory that attains to how God sees us rather than to how we see ourselves in our sinfulness, our brokenness, and our despair. In conclusion, I would like to return very briefly to the notion of friendship. On my view, I've been calling the Catholic Personalist Revolution ransomed friendship from its Kantian captivity. In the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant writes that friendship is, quote, "the union of persons through equal mutual love and respect, an ideal of participating and sharing sympathetically in the other's well-being through the morally good will that unites them," end quote. Thus, human beings have a duty of friendship. At the same time, however, Kant argues that, quote, "friendship is only an idea, though a practically necessary one, and unattainable in practice," end quote. Kant's paradoxical formulation of friendship only admits a striving toward or for friendship. What appears perhaps as a realism or restraint in Kant is revealed in personalism as a fundamental failure to grasp the particularity of the human act. Where Kant sees a cleft between striving and perfection and friendship, The Catholic personalist does not. Striving is itself a moral perfection, a loving expression of a responsibility toward the other. Moreover, striving toward friendship is an end in itself, not a means to the end of a perfect friendship, whatever that would mean. Human friendships do not admit a perfect state, not because we are sinful, though we are, but rather because our capacity to love and be loved knows no limit, and knows no limit precisely because we learn and continue to learn to love and be loved from God, who first loves us and loves us without measure. Thank you.
Magnitude.
You're assuming I can count? And the numbers are, oh, here we go, I see the 2, the other is not readable. So I don't know about you all, but there's a lot here to absorb, and you may have a couple of questions that you're cogitating on to ask, and I have one, and then I don't know if you want to both come up here, and it might be a couple of questions, and then when we're finished, we'll take 3 or 4 questions. When we're done, then I think both Jay and Jenny can hang around a little bit if you want to approach them and get a little bit better acquainted or ask a question. I guess the question I would ask, and then I'm going to go around and take the mic, is given this different trajectory, I mean, how do we, as people coming into that trajectory, how do we encounter the rest of the world when we go out there? And does that mean that we should be acting differently? I mean, I think it does, but how can we sort of operationalize or actualize exactly what you were talking about? Is that a decent question, or you want to try with that? I mean,
Yeah,
and I'll go take this around.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
We have some questions out here, just
So, the question of operationalizing an ethical system, we're not, and I wouldn't impute this to the good Dr. Knight, we're not making an ethical system into a means. An ethical system is in itself. What is nice about personalism is it gives you the rationale for doing that. It's, when John Paul II says that love is the natural attitude and response to the human person, that means it becomes a rational and personal account not to love the other, not to respond lovingly. So it's interesting that it's not a position of piety. It's a position of reason. It's a rational. Once you understand what a human being is, and you understand in what human dignity consists, it becomes irrational to treat others, to respond to others in a way less than lovingly. Which can mean a lot of different things.
So, well, you can state your name and your serial number.
Okay. Could you give us a couple practical examples of what it looks like to treat a person as an object, and maybe the dangers inherent therein, and maybe conversely, some of the beauties of treating persons as persons properly?
I mean, I'm not a really practical person. I like to live in the speculative, but yeah, I mean, thinking about, we're at the gaming school of business, right? So, I mean, any kind of business decision that would supplant the interest of persons to the interest of profit. We could see that also in kind of like in environmental decisions that are made. Like so Pope Francis wrote Laudato Si recently, right? And so he talks a lot about this kind of intergenerational justice, which is actually a Ratzinger quote. He's being continuous with Ratzinger there. But what we do, like when we try to solve a problem and we are only thinking about profit and we're only thinking about maximal returns, it actually like causes
harm, right, to the people who are the most vulnerable, the people who are most economically vulnerable or environmentally vulnerable, even people who have to leave their homes, right, because of flooding or tsunamis or whatever. Like, so the decisions that we make here in America where we don't see the effects elsewhere, right? So it's a kind of sense in which no one person or no group is expendable, right? I mean, even in like acts of charity, right? So Benedict talks in Deus Caritas Est, even when we give charitably to the poor, if we're giving like to this sort of faceless group of the poor or the disenfranchised, that's actually kind of, even materially, it's a good act. What it is, Benedict says, is what people really need is to receive the look of love that we crave, right? It's not just handing somebody $5. It's like, you are a person like with the same dignity as me, you know, and not sort of instrumentalizing that kind of concept. Yeah, you wanna-
Yeah, sure. I mean, so on the one hand, you can look at a lot of the sort of social ills. You know, pornography is a great example of treating human beings as means and not as ends. And that's easy. And there's some easy things out there. But then when you start really reflecting on your own moral decisions, especially in the most, I mean, Jenny and I will next month have been married 16 years. And you think about how easy it is to instrumentalize your partner. And you think, you know, I am treating this person as a means to an end. Jenny cooks, she bakes pies, and by the way, to do things to get her, like to bake pies or something like that. But you know, there's ways in which you slip into instrumentalizing each other. And you can, you know, and on a theological account, you can look back to original sin and the sort of questions of domination that come up in the creation accounts, the first 3 books of Genesis. But in terms of treating people, so I think it's easier to imagine treating people as means to ends rather than ends in themselves. What does that look like? I mean, for a Christian, we have the example of the cross. In giving his life for us on the cross, Jesus gave a gift to humanity of what treating humanity all at once as an end and not a means looks like. And so in a lot of Catholic language, especially at marriage, you find a lot of sort of cruciform language. And so I guess I'd answer the question this way. In terms of what does it mean to treat a person as an end in itself, I hope I know someday what that actually means. And we try to do that, but it's like all things, you develop a habitus of virtue and a sort of moral practice. So you try to be good, you try to treat people as ends in themselves. You do it sometimes, but you get better.
There's this Simone Weil, who's this really interesting kind of Jewish mystic. She has this essay. I really recommend that you would Google it. It's called, what's it called? The Love of God, School Studies. If you just Google Simone Weil, Love of God, School Studies, you'll find it. But she talks about the virtue of attention is really the thing that has to be cultivated. And she says that everything you do, even the boring like calculus problem that you feel like you're gonna die before you get through, but sitting there and struggling and giving it your full attention to solve this math problem, she says that will help you in prayer. That will help you look at another human being and attend to them. And she gives this this really interesting story of a king who's suffering from a really serious wound, and people come and they try to heal him, and and the sort of holy grail, the thing that he really wants is for someone to look at his face and say, what are you going through, right? So that kind of like attention that gets fostered in studying things that are even boring to you or don't come naturally to you. But to see that kind of power of attention, sustained attention, the real fruit of that is in prayer and in being able to look at another human being and say, you know, I see you, right? You know, that's really kind of beautiful.
Kids are great for that, right?
Yeah.
If there's any class of people, of creatures that resist being treated as means, it's kids. Our kids ask us to do ridiculous things all the time that are ways in which you do whatever it is, and that's how you treat someone like an end. There's no calculus in which it benefits me. I may feel good about it later, and that counts against it, I guess, but yeah.
Cole, question? Oh. After you ask a question, I'm gonna take the mic back there.
All right. I don't think this will work.
Yeah. You didn't turn it off, did you? I just got
I didn't do it.
castigated for,
No, that's completely all right.
it's not functioning.
That's okay.
Okay, real loud, Cole,
Yeah,
stand
I'll
up.
be super loud. Well, I was gonna say, I'm gonna see if I can unpack this right. I'm gonna try, obviously this isn't my view, but I kind of the alveoli, and I'm sure you guys just. Yeah. But I was gonna say, both of your talks discuss how the responsibility of love is innate within him and it's not accidental. And how that, especially in your talk, completely contrasts with autonomy, self-rule, self-law.
Kantian.
Yeah, the Kantian version of that. And I was going to say, is there a hard time that many of us have figuring out which one's which? Because I feel like there are many people who look at, who have been inspired by Christ's love to go on and do rather unloving things. So where do we find the line between the two, and how do we just, discriminate between the two?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, so at no point in the phenomenological tradition or the personalist tradition are we talking about anything that's infallible. And there's a whole host of other factors. I mean, sin, of course, is going to be a big factor, but also just human error. And so we'll have a register built in. I mean, so let's make a distinction between people who are inspired to do super weird stuff, benign, and then heinous things. And so you can imagine how okay, so have you ever seen the statues of Moses where he has horns? Have you seen these? It's very common. Like if you go to Notre Dame's campus, we have first down Moses. He has horns, which is actually just a mistranslation of the Latin for crown or sort of corona, some sort of illumination from his head. And so it's stuck. So you can imagine that kind of error that leads into more benign manifestations. But in terms of, and this always feels like punting, but in terms of real evil, of the genuine evil, the Catholic tradition does two things. One is very annoying, it's right, but it's still annoying. And two, it does sort of offer a discursive kind of genealogy of evil. The first is to recognize that if there is a mystery of redemption, sacramental or economies of grace and so forth, there's also a mystery of iniquity. We don't really have any idea what's going on with evil. We don't know who's in play. We don't know what part of ourselves are in play. We just know that it happened and it's not great. So that's the annoying tradition, is to talk about it in terms of mystery. It has to be right, though. I mean, for Catholics especially, mystery is a placeholder. It's sort of algebraic. It holds open the window into a reality that we can't really articulate or describe very well. And second is to give an account of sin, psychological factors, is to provide a whole kind of apparatus by which we can analyze evil as we experience it. So I think it depends on the case. I mean, you have crazy people, you have people like Marquis de Sade, who, whether he was crazy or not, still willed a universal evil. And so all of those sort of moral calculations and all of those characteristics that obtain within that, I think they have to be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. But I think your point stands. It's not easy. And I think for all of the Christian traditions, we have the guidance of our church, we have the guidance of our pastors, we have the guidance of our friends, we have the guidance of Scripture, all those things that help us discern that, which is not infallible, but it's better than nothing.
We have one question. Oh, I guess we have to, we're going to take this question first, and then yours will be the last question, all right?
I understand why we reject Kant's categorical imperative, and particularly because he has no barriers against evil intent of the autonomous selector. But when you talk about a personhood as being essentially relationships, and therefore essentially with no barriers, how do you avoid a completely relativistic ethic?
Yeah, so this is where, and I argue this briefly in the paper, this is where the sort of the what phenomenological analysis consists. So according to Husserl, according to Max Scheler, phenomenological analysis arrives at essential features of an entire class from one particular object or person. So a phenomenological analysis of Jenny, you arrive at what is essential to all human beings. So, and this is what I think is...
Isn't that Kant's error in that he assumes all human beings are exactly like himself, even though he never left his hometown?
Yeah, but so we're talking, I mean, this is one thing that's interesting about phenomenology. When you talk about the different reductions that Husserl kind of puts in register, there's the reduction of the sort of the elimination, the neutralization, uses language, of your personal beliefs, the neutralization of mental states. So when you're doing a phenomenology of a person, you eliminate their mental states. You eliminate your own as the observer, your own sort of dispositions, your own beliefs, right, color. And the idea is, by effecting these series of reductions, you finally arrive at what Husserl calls a sort of eidetic reduction, which you reduce something to its essence. Only in the field of vision. I mean, you're not doing anything transitive to the person or object, but you arrive at what they are essentially. And for him, that consists in something very simple, which is that the human person acts. And from that, an acting person must also be a person. And so he builds it, you build it down to the idea.
But again, if a person is simply an entity that takes action, where does that is completely relativistic. How does a universal standard for goodness exist in that?
It's derived from that. And so the idea is that it's not relativistic insofar as it's the same capacity. This capacity is universal, it's essential to human beings. The actions that come out of that capacity, if we were judging according to those, it would certainly be relativistic. And I think it's just the real insight of personalism. You separate the capacity from the acts that are brought about by the exercise of that capacity. In the same way, if we're talking about something like with vision, if you were saying everyone constructs it, from their own sort of visual experience, that would be relativistic. But if you were talking about, it may be incorrect, but you might say, no, you can derive an ethics from the fact that we all see. We all, for those of us who are sighted, from this one capacity, which is universal or quasi-universal, and that's why
So the universal capacity is the ability to act.
It is the
But it
capacity.
doesn't give us a direction to act.
Yeah, so it's logically prior to the directionality, to the intentionality that engages that capacity. So we're talking about just the capacity. This is what the eidetic reductions will do, is it knocks out all the different things, and that's what he takes it to be at root, the capacity to act.
I'm not there yet.
Okay, that's right. We have one more question, and then we'll be finished for the evening, other than if you want to take some time. Also, as you leave tonight, I think we have some cards for you, not playing cards, but cards with the URL that you need in order to respond to the survey. So, Tom?
So thank you two, for some really stirring papers and a lot of deep thought for us to consider. I guess my question is, do you feel as if the Kantian paradigm, subject-centered, autonomous self, is kind of collapsing under its own weight, running out of gas, whatever, on its own, or is it just intensifying in another form? I'm thinking about, say, scientific studies over the last few decades that, like the butterfly effect, and wow, it doesn't make sense anymore to think that that I'm independent of other beings and that my actions don't impinge on others and that I'm not shaped by others. So maybe another way to look at it is, say, the fate of our planet, and how we could look at it either as, oh, I'm not going to throw this plastic bottle out of the window because what if everybody did it,
Yeah.
Or is it, I'm not going to do that because, well, look at the beauty of this landscape. So maybe just circling around to the question, do you think Kant's paradigm is slowly losing its credibility, or do you feel like it's just showing up in another form?
Yeah, I think it's impressively persistent, and it does admit sort of reformulations. It seems, I mean, in terms of sort of cultural studies, it seems that and I'm much more comfortable talking in psychoanalytic terms than Kantian terms, frankly. But you see, for Kant and for Freud, as a reader of Kant, this notion of the superego. So you have the arising that kind of accompanies the categorical imperative is this sense, this sort of crushing self-judgment that you can't possibly meet it. And when you do meet it, you're not actually meeting it. And so I think the categorical imperative is actually strengthened with the increasing inability to imagine ourselves culturally as being good, being created in God's image and likeness, or whatever moral categories at all. I mean, it seems like it's increasingly more difficult to imagine that we ourselves individually, and certainly no less corporately, as having the capacity to be good. It seems like it's stipulated, I think, in a lot of ways, and the imaginative resources aren't there culturally to give people sort of an image that they can be good, that they can correspond to, that they can strive toward.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Jay's last point. Just in terms of, cultural self-perception. In terms, we don't see ourselves as. The problem is we don't see ourselves as images of God. Really, culturally speaking, we see ourselves as consumers and as constructing a sort of constructions of like social media and that kind of thing, right? That's kind of the form to which we are recorded. It's a really low bar, right? So yeah, I mean, in terms of recovering those imaginative resources, I think we actually have a lot to do culturally, which I think is connected with, with the person that I work on mostly, Balthasar. He talks about this idea of the aesthetic form and beauty, and the sort of sense that beauty, is it makes an ethical demand on someone, right? When you see something really beautiful and you feel that kind of bloom, and you think, there's something else out there besides me and the boring stuff I do. It's like it's an encounter with something beyond yourself, and that is a sort of pull, that eccentric pull toward actual personhood, right? I mean, so he really talks about the need for beauty in religion and in art and that kind of thing too. So yeah, I agree.
And so being in a place like Spring Arbor University, where liberal arts is valued, and talking to Dr. Knight about that business students are into liberal arts, this idea that we have you're building a culture here, as we hope to do at Notre Dame, where students know where to find beauty, and they know to find the resources to imagine themselves as being loved by God and being able to do good.
Thank you.
Thank you.